So welcome everyone to today's show. It is Sunday, May 8th. It is the afternoon before Victory Day in Russia, and everyone's awaiting what announcements, if any, Putin may be planning for his Victory Day parade speech. I'm Dmitry Alperovich, chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitical think tank in Washington, D.C., and with me again is Michael Kaufman, an expert on the Russian military and a research program director in the Russia Studies program at the Center for Naval Analysis. We'll get one more very special guest, hopefully very shortly. But Mike, why don't we start with you? Lots been happening this week, in particular with the Donbas offensive. There's been some late-breaking news today that city of Popasna has been taken by the Russians, or the Ukrainians at least withdrew there. This has been confirmed by Arestovich, the Ukrainian presidential advisor. He also said today, or last night, I should say, that Severodonetsk and Rubezhny may be under major threat. Talk to us about what you see happening in the Donbas and the importance of these developments.
Okay, thanks, Dmitry. Let me kind of just paint a picture of what's been going on, at least from my perspective, from the past week. By the way, mute yourself so you don't hear you typing. So first, to the north around Kharkiv, there's been an ongoing Ukrainian counteroffensive, and it's been fairly successful. I think their main goal has been to push Russian artillery away from the city, and they finally have gotten the city essentially cleared at such a range that it can't be hit by a lot of the Russian artillery that was deployed in this buffer zone the Russian forces were trying to occupy inside of Ukraine. And because Russian forces there are pretty spread out, it looks like they abandoned Stary Saltiv and have been slowly being pushed out by Ukrainian forces who have a decent chance of reaching the border because just the sparsity of Russian forces up in the north. Russian forces along the general offensive, the sort of Siversky Donetsk line, haven't been able to gain much ground in the past week. And I think we've been debating as an local community as to why. You can interpret it a couple different ways. Obviously, there's incredibly stiff Ukrainian resistance, and the correlation of forces isn't that especially favorable to the Russian offensives. On the other hand, they supposedly had concentrated quite a bit of military power there. So I think my personal sense on it, this is based on very imperfect information, is that the Russian military has been pretty cautious and oriented towards reducing losses in this offensive. And they've been fighting a bit more organized and coordinated, but mostly leveraging fires and trying to avoid further loss of manpower. What we can't really tell, I think, as well as how Russian forces have been distributed along the northern line of this offensive. It's a pretty long battlefield in the north, spanning all the way from Izum around Severodonetsk down to Popasna, and that's just the northern side of the fight. I think we're all guessing on what the concentrations of BTGs really are and where they are distributed and what's actually in a BTG at this point. That is, what is the end strength of their unit. So right now, what I think is clear, and this I think is the important takeaway, that the main Russian effort has shifted away from Izum, and it shifted towards Severodonetsk, and they've likely shifted forces behind it too. That means probably more focus on Liman and Yampil, but especially the Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And there's been a Ukrainian counterattack west of Izum that's slowly kind of inching towards Russian supply lines, but it's not really clear what's going on there at this point or how much progress they've made. I suspect that Gerasimov showed up a week ago to get things straightened out in this offensive because it wasn't making much progress. And I'm going to speculate a bit here that he likely introduced some changes and a shift to the overall effort because they were trying a double envelopment, one around Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and another one to try to sever Severodonetsk from the rest of the Ukrainian lines, and that clearly wasn't working out. Probably they didn't have enough forces for it, what have you. So the latest is, yes, that Russian forces, or I think more specifically Wagner, which just seems to be the one area where the PMCs are fighting, took Popasna. Most likely Ukrainian forces conducted a tactical retreat there and are further north around Severodonetsk. Russian forces are also in some part of Rubizhne, although it's not clear what part of the city they've entered. And if I sort of look further south, these are mostly fixing attacks. If you look towards this whole long line in Zaporizhia, fighting between Russian and Ukrainian forces, it looks still that the main Russian objective is probably Velika Novosilka, but they haven't made much success in the south. I don't think that the southern military district has a lot of manpower available towards those attacks, and they probably still are waiting to resolve the situation down in Azovstal and Mariupol. So, general takeaway is that this offensive is probably going to drag on. It's going to drag on for some time, and we're going to see numerous counterattacks by the Ukrainian forces as it goes on. And it's not going to be clear necessarily how things are shaking out in just the coming days, or even perhaps weeks. But I think it's safe to say that given the forces the Russian military has available, how they're employing them, and the Ukrainian resistance, there are not likely to be any sudden or major breakthroughs. And I think that was pretty predictable and predicted by a number of analysts looking at this problem set. Okay, I think I've taken enough time at a kind of introduction.
No, it's great. A couple of follow-up questions. One, Izum has been such a major logistic hubs for them, obviously major rail links going into that city. What do you think it means that they've kind of stopped or decreased their activity in that area and have been subjected to Ukrainian counterattacks? Can that endanger, from a logistics perspective, the entire Donbas offensive?
Not necessarily, to be honest. First, it just remains to be seen whether the Ukrainian military has the ability to interdict those ground lines of communication. But second, if they shift a lot of the effort towards Severodonetsk, then it's a bit of a different conversation, because then they're likely pursuing an entirely different operational approach into how they're trying to take the Donbas. It's clear that things are not working out for them well south of Izum for a number of reasons. And like I said, we're kind of debating the causes. So I'm probably looking at the map. I would be much more concerned, if I was the Russian military, about the Ukrainian counteroffensive by Izum, far less concerned about the one north by Kharkiv, because they're not really running the logistics or rail line anywhere directly near there.
Got it. And with regards to Severodonetsk, Rubezhny, and Popasna, that Arestovich talks about, are those strategic points? How critical is it that the Ukrainians are falling back?
So, Rubezhny basically suggests that they're inching closer and closer from the north to Severodonetsk. Popasna is strategic because one of the main Russian efforts is to try to break through at that southern point there, and then pinch Ukrainian lines to try to sever the connection with Severodonetsk, and at the same time try to potentially break through south around Yampil. If you look at Yampil is between kind of Slavyansk and Lysychansk, and you can kind of picture a pincer movement, one from Popasna and one coming down through Yampil. But they've been moving incredibly slowly, right? And they've been taking these towns, or to what extent they've been taking them, versus Ukrainians have just been retreating from them, but at an incredibly slow pace. So I think it's given the Ukrainian military plenty of time to react and figure out what they want to do. So I don't think you're going to see a sudden breakthrough and rapid encirclement of Ukrainian forces, although it's pretty clear what the Russian military is trying to do.
And how long do you think they can continue this offensive? At what point they're taking significant casualties, obviously, right now, particularly in equipment. Can they keep this going for months? Can they keep this going for weeks? What's your sense of their ability to continue major operations?
So I don't know, because a lot you don't know about the actual state of Russian forces and how well they're supplied and what the morale is, but I actually think they can sustain it for a while, and I'll tell you why. I think part of the reason they're advancing slowly is because they're in a lot of areas they're not committing, and they're doing a lot of reconnaissance, and then when they make contact, they retreat, and then they leverage artillery fires to try to degrade Ukrainian positions and suppress them. So to put it in kind of glib terms, they're playing this quite differently than they had the first phase of the war. And even though they still have visible issues in overall performance, I think they're trying to minimize casualties, and that might be why they're advancing slowly. I mean, you could also read it a different way, which is that their will and desire to fight is much lower in there, and that's also why there isn't sort of this great enthusiasm, perhaps, amongst the forces for the offensive. But that's just speculation. I'm far less concerned about the logistical equation. I'll be very honest. Whenever we get into these conversations about what's happening in the war, people will often use logistics as a kind of hand-waving device. And I'm not seeing a lot of problems in terms of ammunition supply for Russian artillery. And so my basic view is, unless you know something specific that's going on with logistics, please do not tie problematic logistics as a cause of some kind of outcome. Like if we don't know, let's say we don't know, but let's not hand wave and say the logistics aren't good when we actually have no idea what's going on with logistics.
Now, the one other thing that a lot of people have talked about before this war began was weather and mud, right? A lot of mud experts turned up on Twitter talking about the mud in Ukraine in the springtime. What's your sense of the weather affecting operations, their ability to do off-roading? Any concerns there?
I mean, it's getting pretty dry, but it's a mix. And then there's also other issues with off-roading. For example, there's minefields. You see plenty of videos of Russian vehicles running into Ukrainian mines. So you can easily funnel a force by organizing your defense around key ground lines of communications and then putting down mines in other sectors. I'm kind of increasingly seeing a mix of Russian forces using roads, but also maneuvering off-road. So it does look as though the terrain is at least partially drying out in some areas. But I don't see it necessarily as the decisive factor or the significant factor. And the people who are talking about mud in the run up to the war, remember, I was involved in that conversation. They were right. It's always wrong to fixate on any one specific thing as being deterministic. And don't forget something very important. Weather affects both sides. It may not necessarily affect them equally or evenly, but it affects both sides. Okay, it's not like there's mud and the mud only affects the Russian ability to maneuver, but not the Ukrainian ability to counterattack because Ukraine has hover tanks. That's not true.
What's your take on mobilization? We had an interesting video come up yesterday on Channel 1 from someone named Mikhail Khodornyuk, I think a reservist officer in the Russian military, who was talking actually very negatively about mobilization, saying that it won't really change things on the ground, but he was kind of fixating on the wrong things. In some ways, he was talking about building ships that takes years, building air squadrons, that's going to take a long time. But then he actually said, well, tank division will take us 90 days to bring up. And that to me seemed very interesting. If they could actually bring up a new tank division and throw it into the fight within 90 days, that could be very significant. Do you think that's actually plausible? Do you think that they're going to need some sort of mobilization, maybe not a full mobilization? What are your thoughts overall on this mobilization question?
Yeah, this conversation has really livened up in the past week. Remember a long time ago, at least as far as this war has gone, I had mentioned that because the Russian military is trying to fight this war at peacetime strength, this is likely to be their last offensive, for the simple reason that they do not have the manpower availability. They don't have the force structure to sustain further offensive operations beyond this one. And it's going to be a challenge for them to just sustain this conflict as it stands. And so they will need a way to raise manning across the force, even just to rotate forces through Ukraine. And very likely without some form of partial mobilization, they stand a strong chance of losing, even with mobilization. It's not a magic wand. It doesn't necessarily change Russian forces. But I don't think the conversation on mobilization is framed right in terms of what it is, what it does, and what it means. First, the real question is whether or not Vladimir Putin will declare a general state of war, as opposed to continuing to try to fight this as a special operation. And there's a huge difference for that. There's no rule of law in Russia, but Russia's an insanely procedural state, and these things matter. So the people who say that Putin can just do whatever he wants, independent of whether or not a state of war exists, I'm going to disagree. That's not really true. So here's the policies this affects. First, a state of war would allow them to enact stop-loss policies. That means conscripts which are now being demobilized as of May 1st will not necessarily be demobilized. They can choose to keep them in service. Second, it means contract servicemen, which a lot of the military fighting, can't resign. Contract servicemen can actually refuse to fight. They can quit. I mean, the Russian military makes it very hard for them, but nonetheless, they can.
And there are some reports of this actually happening. So this is not just hypothetical.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's no state of war, and they can tear up their contract and say, "I'm leaving the Russian military. Thank you for rotating me back to Russia. I don't want to go back to the fighting, and I'm going to tear up my agreement." Yes, there'll be penalties for them, but they're probably not as bad as dying. So, point being, it changes the legal status of combatants. It changes their options, what they can do. Then, the Russian leadership can enact a partial mobilization, and they're probably going to go after men with recent military experience. And the notion that anybody you just bring in that you mobilize is untrained and suddenly you have to train them, that's not exactly true. Actually, Russia has a lot of manpower. There's personnel who have just left the military or going to be rotating out of the military or have rotated out in the last year. And they haven't suddenly forgotten all the skills that they had before. Okay. So the retraining period.
In other words, if you used to drive a tank a few years ago, you still know how to drive a tank, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, they're demobilizing right now around 130,000 conscripts. I mean, you're going to seriously argue to me that the day after these people forgot how to shoot an AK-47 or drive a tank? And that's not the case. These are perishable skills, but they're not that instantaneously perishable. And a lot of positions that they may look to fill may not be that technically demanding. So, long story short, they do have access to manpower with recent experience and very likely some veterancy as well, depending on who they choose to mobilize if they go that route. They've already been trying a shadow mobilization behind the scenes the last month and a half by offering short-term service contracts down to 4 months for a lot of money to try to pick up men with prior service experience and see if they can get them to sign up as contract servicemen. Russian formations have a substantial percentage in them of conscripts, particularly in the ground forces. And many of them could be up to 30-35%. So they have deployed, let's say, 2 battalion tactical groups from each regiment and brigade. But back in the main formation, there are very likely to be some officers with another battalion plus staffed by conscripts, potentially, hundreds of them. And now conscripts which cannot legally be used in an offensive operation outside of Russia's borders, unless there's a time of war, could now be used. They can be put together with other forces, and the rest of the formation could potentially be deployed. So it opens up access to another part of the force, right? Now, in practice, everything is harder. I'm painting this with a very broad brush. But there are several layers to this that I think folks need to appreciate. And this is before we even get to the notion of a broader mobilization. There's getting more manpower and pulling equipment out of reserve storage areas, which, is very much a mixed bag proposition. You don't know what's there that's active and serviceable, and you don't know to what extent the Russian military can actually conduct mobilization. Remember, this is not the Soviet army. It's not organized to take in vast amounts of manpower on short notice and to sort them into units with cadre staffs. That being true, the Russian military doesn't need to go through that process at all. It doesn't need that much more manpower per se in order to replenish ranks and necessarily sustain this war, but it definitely needs a lot more than it has now. Sorry, it's a bit of a long explanation, but it's a complex topic, and I'm seeing divergent takes on it.
Yeah, no, this is really fascinating. I put out a long thread about a week ago explaining why I think the full mobilization, sort of conscripts, massive conscripts and drafts, was very unlikely. But you are suggesting actually a middle ground between doing nothing and doing a full mobilization, which is to declare a state of war and bring in some people with recent experience, either conscripts or contracts that have left the service. And I think that certainly is very plausible and doesn't necessarily create a lot of political problems for them, right?
Yeah, so I think the full mobilization is kind of a bit of a canard, right? And I don't see that as likely at all. But the significant question is whether or not he's going to declare a state of war, because that then changes things a lot procedurally, and whether or not they will then shift to using conscripts and raising manning in ways other than simply trying to attract people with money, right? Because I don't know how many people they're going to get by just raising the amount of money they're willing to pay per month. But there are significant effects to this approach, and the main impact is that it will substantially alter our expectations for how long Russia can sustain this war. Doesn't mean Russia's going to win it. It doesn't mean they're going to do great in some follow-on offensives, but it means that this war is going to drag on much longer, and it means that they will have potentially enough manpower to sustain this fight, even if it's a losing fight for a considerable period of time. Remember, I always say annoyingly that everything's contingent, so I don't like predicting what's going to happen, at the actual tactical operational level. I'm just trying to suggest, if we take the art of the long view, what the implications of that would be relative to where we are right now.
Got it. Let's talk about Snake Island. We had a lot of activity in that area over the last 48 hours. The Ukrainians have achieved some major successes, taking out a Tor air defense system with the TB2, and then doing a heavy ordnance strike with Su-27s against some positions there. And now the Russians are claiming that they've actually abandoned the island. And it appears to be uninhabited. At this point, there's still some debate about a helicopter that was shot down, whether it was a Ukrainian helicopter or the Russian helicopter. Both sides are claiming that they took out the others. Mi-8 troop-carrying helicopter that was trying to land forces on the island. What's the significance if the island has been abandoned, as the Russians saying that it has been? How critical was it to the enforcement of the Black Sea blockade? What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's a story that's gotten some attention, mainly because a lot of videos have bled all over Twitter of Ukrainian TB2s striking Russian forces on Snake Island, and actually Ukrainian Su-27s conducting a strike, and so on and so forth. And it's been a bit of a puzzling situation to sort out, but I think my impression of what happened was Russian forces originally ended up on Snake Island. If you remember, at the beginning of the war, they approached the small Ukrainian contingent there, demand they surrendered, that they surrender. Ultimately, I think the Marines there did surrender. Then the Russian military emplaced some small number of units on the island. Snake Island is tiny. It's really a rock. I'm not going to say that technically because it was the subject of a very long legal dispute between Ukraine and Romania as to whether or not it was an island or a rock under international law, which I will not go into further because everyone here will fall asleep and leave this actual Twitter chat if they hear that story. But suffice it to say, it's very small and not very inhabitable. So it looks like they emplaced a few Russian units there, tiny contingent with some air defense, very vulnerable out in the sea. I don't think Dmitry was that relevant to enforcing the blockade for a simple reason. A Tor M2 and the Strela M short-range air defense system, these systems have tiny air defense ranges, don't enforce much of anything, and it's not like there were coastal defense cruise missile batteries or over-the-horizon radar or much of anything else on that island. So I'm not really sure necessarily what relevance it played. On the other hand, maybe they had a vision of the future of the things they were going to in place on it. And if they had secure control, some of these other capabilities would have been deployed there down the line. So, long story short, Ukrainian forces came after this tiny number of air defense systems on this rock with TB2s, took them out, and then that left the Russian contingent completely open to airstrike. And after losing those air defenses, they essentially became prey to various Ukrainian capabilities. And then it was hard to tell if the Russian military was trying to reinforce the island or if they're trying to evacuate the island from the videos. But in general, their position there completely deteriorated. And to me, well, the videos reflect a basic problem with the Russian approach, which is sort of like send one unit without air cover, then send another unit without air cover and support to try to help that one, then send a third unit in a helicopter to try to figure out what happened with special forces and maybe try to rescue who's left, and so on and so forth. And in many ways, the challenge they've had in this war is that they're masters of piecemeal operations without good integration. You know, just sending in units piecemeal. And in the case of Snake Islands, I think it was pretty easy for Ukrainian TB2s to just ambush them as they were trying to get stuff either on or off the island. At least that's just my perspective based on what I saw. Obviously, this is very, very imperfect impression of one person looking at tactical vignettes.
So in your sense is that this was a great moral victory, perhaps, but not necessarily a strategic victory to drive Russians off the island.
I mean, I'm sure driving them off the island helps, but I didn't see any particular capabilities on the island that made it that significant or relevant. The island is located along a maritime route, that's for sure. But the Russian military doesn't necessarily need that island, if anything. From my point of view, it was a huge liability because it's basically a completely indefensible position. Right? Tiny islands like that, tiny flat islands, are incredibly vulnerable. And it doesn't look like they were providing anything in the way of air coverage for it, and it didn't look like the Russian Navy really came to the rescue either, other than those Raptor boats, which themselves are very vulnerable to air attack.
Well, the reason they didn't is, of course, because they tried to before and they got the Moskva sinking as a result, right? So they're trying to stay far away out of the range of the Neptune batteries right now.
Yeah, it was still debated where the Moskva actually was when it was hit. But as you probably know, if you've seen my comments this past week, as I tried to circle back to the Moskva, I had a lot of questions about to what extent Moskva was really operational when we look at its radar and its radar as it pertained to its air defense systems, and whether or not the Moskva really was providing air defense coverage in that part of the sea. That's an area at least of speculation.
We of course are still trying to get a guest in that is an expert on this, and we're hoping that we can get him in to chat about this. If not, we may just do a recording and add it to the podcast later on. But let me ask you, Mike, about TB2s. You made a comment about that last week, but this week we saw some major developments in the field of unmanned aerial vehicle warfare because we had the Ukrainians do a successful strike against surface vehicle, surface ship with regards to those high-speed boats. It may have taken down the Hilo, the Mi-8 Hilo. We don't yet have a confirmation on that yet. It has taken out air defenses. It's been used extensively in this war on both sides to do artillery targeting. Do you think that we're seeing before our eyes here warfare being fundamentally changed with the introduction of these unmanned aerial vehicle platforms beyond just the use of them for reconnaissance and kind of singular strikes against ground forces that we have seen over the last 20 years?
No, but most of the time when you ask me, are we seeing anything in warfare fundamentally change? My answer typically is no. I think UCAVs and various armed drones of this type are ultimately remotely piloted aircraft, and they have a lot of advantages to them. They're often cheaper. They're cheaper to maintain because of the pilots, although not necessarily cheaper as a whole. When we've done studies in the United States that have been published on cost of operating things like predator drones and the like relative to manned aviation, it's a bit of a mixed bag. It's a lot. It's not as cheap as you might think. Of course, it depends on who's operating the platform. I think the main advantage of these systems is obviously they're lucrative relative to similar types of manned aviation, like let's say helicopters. They have much longer endurance and loiter time, and it's easy to use them from the standpoint of cost imposition in a conflict where attrition matters, because you can trade this platform for almost anything else on the battlefield, and the loss of the drone, well, it's easier to replace, and it's a much cheaper system than almost anything it has to engage and fight. So it's pretty advantageous. I didn't see anything particularly new and exciting on Snake Island. That's the way the war's been going. Ukrainians have used TB2s pretty effectively. To be honest, more effectively than I anticipated. On the other hand, there's strong suspicion that they lost quite a few from the first batch that they had as well, and that these drones are likely from a second batch that they received recently from Turkey. That's why we have pauses in video feed for some weeks, and then a return to drone strike footage. That's one thesis. I'm not gonna say that I kind of support that discussion either way, but in terms of drones in general, well, they mostly fall down to two categories. To me, the UCAVs are less interesting than loitering munitions. All right, and those I think have an even more significant effect. And now that you see that Ukraine has increasingly gained access to Western loitering munitions, Russia's been using them too to a limited extent since the beginning of the war. They could have significant tactical impact over time.
Well, let me just ask you a direct question, not related to this war, but we have seen the Russians take significant casualties as a result of these strikes across a variety of weapons platforms. I mean, how vulnerable is the United States military to the same tactics that can be used by a variety of actors that are buying up TB2s right now?
Pretty vulnerable, especially to things like loitering munitions. I think most militaries are, and maybe less so to TB2s, but U.S. military often has the expectation of operating in an environment where it has complete air superiority, right? And that's why you don't see nearly as much air defense and support capabilities in U.S. ground formations. And I often think that, at least from my point of view, this is a mistake that Western militaries make, because you can't just take air superiority for granted. Even though I think we definitely have the most capable air power and air power projection capability in the world, that still is not something that you can assume, especially early on in any battle space. And air superiority may not deliver protection from various types of small drones. And commercial off the shelf systems. For example, you see Ukrainians repurposing old Soviet anti-tank grenades and dropping them from commercial drones onto Russian vehicles. And these are tiny, tiny drones. I mean, you're not necessarily going to solve them by having air superiority or air dominance on the battle space. So it's a much longer conversation. Probably, certainly merits its own podcast. To be frank, I've had these discussions fairly recently after the Nagorno-Karabakh war, where folks asked the same question: have drones changed or revolutionized everything? And the answer is no, but they do have an effect on aspects of modern warfare.
Yeah, and particularly now that we're seeing them impact not just ground forces, but naval forces as well, and perhaps even aviation. The Twitter account that I'm sure you know well, Jomini W, has some really interesting insights into this war and the correlation of forces. And this individual had a great thread the other day about how this offensive may see a long, drawn-out siege of the urban cluster that is ranging from Kramatorsk to Lysychansk, and that this can go on for many months. Do you agree with that? That this is a possibility here, that we're going to have a lot of urban fighting in that area for many, many weeks?
Yeah. So Germany is a good colleague, and of course, Germany's been long dead. He's a famous military theorist. Right. That's not the man's actual name. I just want to make that clear. I'm not actually from a prior century in colleagues with Germany, but the person who runs that account is a good colleague. I think he does good analysis, and I think I'm generally on the same page with this offensive being a dragged out affair, and that it's going to shift. And at various points, we're going to have claims that this offensive has failed, this offensive is making progress, Ukrainian counteroffensives are making progress, and so on and so forth. And all of those at various points will be true. But I think my disappointing answer is that this offensive and what gains the Russian military is or is not able to make is not going to be decided in days or even necessarily weeks. And it's a question of whether they'll be able to hold on to the gains they make and to what extent Ukrainian force can sustain counteroffensives as well. And it's likely to shift. So Ukrainian military may make some gains outside of Izum, and the Russian military might make substantial gains around Severodonetsk. It's hard to say how it will play out, but I think it's important that the expectations are set correctly, that this is something that's likely to drag on. And of course, because I said that, Putin will come out tomorrow and just declare victory. I'm kidding. I don't think that's going to happen. I just don't think that's going to happen. But
yeah, well, he can declare limited victory with Mariupol. There's talk that maybe they'll even do some sort of limited parade there. But if you're right, is this battlefield going to start looking a lot more like the battlefield we've seen for the last 8 years in the Donbas from 2014, where it's semi-frozen? Obviously this would be across a much larger line of contact, and much more active with artillery and air power than we've seen in the past. But if you're not going to see sort of this massive move troopments making significant gains in tens of kilometers, is it going to be much more static volleys of artillery fire?
I don't think so. I think it's too soon to make this kind of claim. I suspect that this offensive will drag on, and there will be genuine shifts in territorial control between Russia and Ukraine. And it remains to be seen how both sides are going to invest in their staying power in the war. At least the Ukrainian and the Western strategy is very clear. Ukraine has mobilized personnel. It has a solid manpower base. And with access to Western equipment and, most importantly, ammunition, because the most decisive element in this war is effective use of artillery. Sorry to all the folks that think it's drones and drone videos on Twitter. That's important for the information environment, sure. But it's artillery that's doing most of the work in this war. Classic, traditional Soviet, actually, most of it's Soviet artillery. Now increasingly some Western made. And the most important thing to artillery, beyond having effective targeting, is ammunition. And having access to this gives Ukraine strong staying power and prospects for retaking territory in the war. That said, our conversation earlier in this podcast about whether or not Russia will declare a state of war, will enact some form of partial mobilization, and how they're going to try to address some of their manpower issues is very relevant and very actual to trying to assess to what extent Russia is staying power in this conflict, and how long they could sustain it, and whether or not it'll settle into war of attrition, and what Russia's prospects are in that war of attrition.
Got it. Any last thought, Mike? The guest that we were trying to get is actually has not been able to log into Twitter. I'll record an interview with him separately, and we'll release it as a podcast shortly. But any last thoughts on where this war is going? Anything that we haven't covered yet?
I mean, I think we've had a really good discussion. Um, it's a shame that our colleague couldn't join us because of technical issues today. Now, I think you've covered it on the whole quite well. A big question is, if we look out into the future trajectory of this war, whether or not we see the two sides' objectives and demands in any way overlap that would suggest settlement. My answer is going to be very pessimistic. The answer is no. Ukrainian position is, I think, at a bare minimum, they want to retake territory lost since February 23rd. That's going to be quite incompatible with the Russian demand to take the Donbas and hold on to the southern territories of Kherson and Zaporizhia that they've captured, at least in piecemeal.
And by the way, we had Zelensky declare this week how he defines victory, which is Russia going back to the February 2022 borders and ending hostilities, which doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon.
Right. So I actually think it's quite likely that Russia will attempt to annex either the Donbas or the South or both. At the very least, we'll set up the South now as their own people's republics. And I don't see much compatibility in how Russia sort of defines victory with how Ukraine defines victory. So that basically tells me that this war is going to go on. And there may be operational pauses in it as both sides build up for offensives down the line. It obviously depends on what they do with force structure and the like. But I guess my outlook's been consistently quite dour. So that's what tells me about the long-term prospects in this conflict.
And last question here: who do you think gets a more favorable outlook here the longer this goes on, the Ukrainians or the Russians? Given that the Ukrainians are getting a significant amount of military help, they still have a lot of personnel resources, and the Russians obviously have all the issues that we've discussed.
I'm going to give you a bit of a caveated answer. I think on the whole right now, under these conditions, it's definitely the Ukrainian side of in this conflict. However, perhaps paradoxically, it is often the losing side that gets to decide when the war is over.
What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is the side that's losing has to be the one that eventually concedes for a war to be over, more often than not.
So in other words, Putin has to decide to cut his losses and leave.
Yeah, meaning he could be losing for a very long time.
Yep.
And even if Russian forces are in the most dire shape, you could still look to continue the conflict in a number of ways or to escalate it. So that's what I mean by that.
And at what point do you think he's going to start to have major issues with equipment, particularly with missiles, precision-guided munitions? There's been a lot of speculation that maybe the stockpile is already low. We don't know, of course, but at some point they're going to run out of these things, and their capacity to produce them is very limited given the embargo on microchips.
I mean, on long-range precision-guided weapons, definitely. Although I don't think we know what the stockpiles were to start with, and I too am guilty of some of that speculation, while recognizing that we're trying to figure out what they have left without actually knowing necessarily what they started with. But eventually, if they're not running low now, they definitely will be. On materiel, well, in certain categories of equipment, they've lost about 15 to 20% of their active force, and it's not critical, but it's definitely going to bite over time. And looking out over the coming months and years, the big question will be what is the likely impact of all the sanctions, the export controls, and cutting Russia off of Western components, including support for the machine tools that they use. And that definitely is going to affect the Russian defense industry. But I think the community is yet to figure out to what extent, how, and so on and so forth. So that's a current area of debate and research. It's a little early. it's a little early to tell. It's going to be a significant impact. I think that we often talk about this conflict in terms of potentially being a war of attrition, but if you look and assume it's going to last a much longer period of time, that's essentially two campaigns premised on a strategy of exhaustion. Russia trying to exhaust Ukraine, and the West trying to exhaust Russia.
Fascinating as always, Mike. That's a wrap from us today, folks. Please listen to the recording. We'll try to put it out shortly. It will include an interview with our colleague on the Moskva sinking and what's happening with the Russian Black Fleet. It'll be, I'm sure, very fascinating. But for now, have a good evening, and thanks for joining us again. Take care.
Thanks for having me back on.
Thanks.
And we're back now with a new guest, retired Navy Captain Chris Carlson, formerly with the Defense Intelligence Agency and Naval Intelligence, and an expert on anti-ship missiles. And Chris, thank you for joining us today. I really wanted to talk to you because you had written a great report on how Moskva, this flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, may have been sunk by the Ukrainian Neptune missiles, anti-ship missiles. And I wanted to discuss that with you. A lot of people were puzzled by the fact that the ship obviously has a variety of anti-air defense systems, even though it's quite old, built in the 70s. Nevertheless, it has significant capabilities, including an S-300 system, even on board the Maritime One. So what did you find in your analysis?
Okay, the big point that I heard Michael talk about was, were the air search radars energized? That's one I'm not going to be able to help you with. I'm going to assume that she was fulfilling her role as an air defense coordinator because she had the most powerful radar, assuming it worked. She had the most powerful radar out there in what NATO calls a top pair. It's a humongous fly swatter on the main mast, and it's a three-dimensional air search, and it has quite a long range. But that's not the radar that would see a sea skimmer like Neptune or Harpoon. If you were to look at both of the main radars on a Slava-class cruiser, there's this great big thing in front, if you will, and then there are two smaller arrays behind them. Those smaller ones actually have a surface search capability. The one on the top pair is the old big net, and the one on the top steer is a head net A or B. We don't know which one exactly, I think. You have to look at the its transmission qualities. Those specifically look low. So if she was radiating, one of those two radars, in theory, should have gotten contact. I mean, a Neptune is a very small target. It's not super stealthy. It's relatively small. And so you would expect to pick this up as it came over the radar horizon. But the bottom line is it doesn't really matter if it was radiating or not. She did not react. So either the radars didn't work and she didn't see it, or the crew didn't process and react in time to deal with the incoming threat. And in both cases, that would show us why the S-300 top dome director and the OSA MA point defense SAM directors were in their normal stowed position facing aft. They were never brought online. So whether or not the radars were on, they didn't see it, or if they saw it, saw the missiles coming, they didn't react fast enough to be able to engage with defensive armament.
Do you think it was complacency? They didn't think that Neptunes were operational. They knew that the Ukrainians hadn't yet brought them back online. The plan was to do so in April, but maybe they thought that the war prevented them from getting those systems up and running, or was it just incompetence, or both?
For the Russians, I'm going to go down two paths, if you will. One, Moskva was the original Slava. Okay, the very first of the class. Okay, she was commissioned late 1982. She has yet to see a full up overhaul. They worked on the propulsion plan to return that to technical readiness. That means that it will work. And then there's been rumors and articles put out that money for other aspects of an overhaul were siphoned away, that the money was stolen. And so she has not had a major overhaul, and she's what, 40 years old? So you have to ask the question, what kind of material condition is he in? And remember, Russians aren't horribly big on at-sea maintenance. They do most of their stuff in port. So how well are things working? And then how much training have the crew got in air defense? If the Russians have been skimping on operational things like dedicated training, then, and you have, let's say you have new operators on top of that, they don't understand their pieces of equipment. They don't know how to work with it confidently. It takes them time. And that's a bit of a problem because you don't have a lot of time when you have a Mach 0.8 missile coming over the horizon. You need to be able to react with confidence and relatively quickly. That comes with training.
How much time would they have if they had seen it?
What? Let's assume 20 miles. They'd have a couple of minutes.
Okay, so very, very quick.
Yeah, it would be very fast. And that's the other thing that I'm really kind of concerned about, is because the director on the POP group, as NATO calls it, there's an actual antenna on top of it, not just the directing aspect for the OSA-MA rock missiles. That's a scanning antenna. It's called BAZA. And its main purpose is to completely eliminate reaction time by transferring contact from one of the main radars to the POP group to be able to point. So if they were in a threat environment, that thing should have been spinning. And they should have seen, and I mean, that's a dedicated sea skimmer looking radar. They should have seen her, the missiles coming over with that system. Again, there's no indication it was operating.
But, you know, I read your report with great interest, and then I heard an interview with one of the Ukrainian commentators on it saying, well, the ship, obviously all the photographs we have of the ship is when it was hit already and on fire. And the commentator was saying that at that moment, you have to assume that the ship no longer had power, and that's why it wasn't spinning. You can't necessarily assume that it hadn't been spinning prior to getting hit. How do you respond to that?
When you look at the antennas, all of them are in their stowed position, including the BAZA. It's facing aft. Now, there's no spinning down, if you will. You lose power, you're done. So that's what, and the other thing is that the SAN-4, the OSA-MA hatch, is not opened, and the missiles have not been extended. Okay, this is a mechanical launcher. It's stowed below. That circular area opens up in half. The missiles come up and train. They're not there. Therefore, this system was not engaged.
How much of this do you think is sort of an element of the fact that this is a Black Sea fleet where traditionally they have not had, you know, major adversaries, right? That it really is mostly, you know, a pawn for the Russians. The Ukrainians don't have much of the way of the Navy, and, you know, other NATO countries in the Black Sea also don't have massive naval assets compared to what they would face, for example, in the Baltic Sea or in the Pacific, with their Pacific fleet. Do you think that they've just under-resourced the Black Sea fleet because of that, or is this something that could be prevalent across the entire Russian Navy?
Parts of it is prevalent across the entire Russian Navy. Maintenance is an expensive thing, and it has never been a Russian or Soviet strong point. They've had to push things downrange because they just lack the material and the resources to do it. And that's largely a function of where Putin has put his emphasis. And for the Russian Navy, that's into submarines. That's really where he's put his big time. I mean, they'd love to build another aircraft carrier. Well, they'd love to get Kuznetsov back. Well, there's that. They wanted to build this ungodly, ugly destroyer, lighter. All those things got kicked down the road. They had this issue with their Grigoroviches finishing that because the guys they're at war with provided them their propulsion plant. And I'm still waiting for Saturn to formally issue their first manufactured propulsion complex. I've seen things saying, yeah, it's almost done, it's ready, and they were showing Putin, and it's like, okay, are you going to start building again? So, they're concentrating on smaller ships, and they're concentrating on newer ones. So the Black Sea Fleet actually is, I think, done fairly well. It got all 3 of the Grigoroviches. It's got 6 of the new Kilos that are club capable. And they're getting a couple of the smaller boats. And that's probably not bad for the Black Sea. That's a reasonable foot. And, of course, they had Moskva as the flagship. So I wouldn't say the Black Sea was worse off per se than the Baltic or the Pacific. They probably weren't as good as the Northern Fleet, but the Northern Fleet has always been kind of, favored in a lot of ways. And the Pacific is still trying to catch up now that they're finally getting their Dolgorukis, and one of the Yasin M's is supposed to go out there. I'm still waiting for that.
Well, the Turks have blocked the Bosphorus, right? So
right,
you can get into the Black Sea right now because of the hostilities. Now, there's been a lot of rumors this week about the Admiral Makarov being taken down. The Ukrainians have officially denied it in the last 24, 48 hours. Do you think that the Neptune missiles, first of all, what do you make of the Neptune missiles that are based on the Soviet KH-35 design? How capable are they? And do you think they pose a major threat to the rest of the Black Sea surface fleet?
Okay, first off, the Neptune is not based on the KH-35. It's based on the KH-35U.
Okay.
Which is an upgraded version of that weapon with a lot further range. This people call it the Harpoonski, and that's really kind of what it is. It's a relatively small subsonic sea skimming anti-ship cruise missile. The warhead's about 145 kilograms. And those are not easy to deal with, but they're not impossible. And the funny thing is that the systems on board Moskva were tailored towards the Exocet and the Harpoon. Okay, when you look at the SAN-4, the OSA-MA, and the original OSA system was not sea skimmer capable when it first came out. This is like the 3rd generation of that particular system, and it's specifically designed to go after missiles coming in at 10 meters or less altitude. The Ukraine bird does. It cruises at 10, and it comes down to about 3 or 4 in its terminal attack. So, contrary to what some people said, this is not really an old design. This is an updated version, so it's got more range. The Seeker is different, and it's got more capabilities in the electronic warfare department. And I'm a little surprised that some people are wondering, because we've been seeing test shots of Neptune since I believe late 2017, early 2018. So this thing's been out there for a while.
Not operational, though, right?
Say again?
Not operational.
I have not seen it operational until they actually said, I think March, April 2022 is when they thought they would bring it online.
Right.
I've seen lots of brochures for it. They've been marketing this puppy to a number of places. And in that PDF, I attached the 3 slides to the most recent brochure that I found online.
Got it. Now, there's news now recently that Britain is going to send the Brimstone anti-ship missiles to Ukraine within weeks. Does that change the game at all? How capable are those missiles versus the Neptunes?
Well, a Brimstone's really, think of it as like Hellfire, because that's what it's based on, that they're cousins. And that's really an anti-tank weapon. But if it's got a bulk charge explosive warhead, it's going to do pretty much a lot of damage to smaller ships, because that's what they were designed to do. We made the Hellfire module for the LCS to take out small ships, small boats. It'll do that just fine. Against, say, a Grigorovich frigate, it'll be problematic. It'll be hard because it's a really, really small missile. But the problem is that you're going to be firing it inside the envelope of that vertical launch Still missile. So the question then is, who's the threat to, the missile or the carrier? I don't know.
The range is much shorter than the Neptunes, right?
Oh God, yes.
Yeah.
It's line of sight. If I remember Brimstone correctly, we're talking 20 to 25 kilometers. So that's an order of magnitude less than the Neptune.
Yeah. So Chris, let me ask you this: what are the implications of this strike on the Moskva for the rest of the fleet and for their ability to enforce the blockade on the Ukrainian ports, which is currently strangling the Ukrainian economy?
They're going to have to actually operate as if they're in a wartime environment. Because I'm not sure they really thought that. That may have been part of the problem. I mean, the Ukrainian fleet was, pretty much, it wasn't much to speak of to begin with. But what they did have, as they moved into Nikolaev and other places, they were gone. I mean, how much of the Ukrainian fleet still floats?
Nothing.
So, nothing. And there's no submarine threat because the one Foxtrot they got when they took the Crimea. So, from their perspective, what's the threat? And, the drone, that's a big problem, but not necessarily, an existential threat to something as big and as nasty as a Slava. It's definitely going to be nasty to your Raptors. Don't get me wrong there. And your Baikovs aren't probably going to like it either. But those are all smaller. So they were kind of going, well, the Black Sea's ours. So, because if you look at some of the OSINT tracking with the synthetic aperture radars that H.I. Sutton and others have put out, you start seeing Moskva kind of hanging out in the same place all the time.
Yep.
She's got a couple of places she goes back and forth from, and then goes into Sevastopol, refuels, whatever, comes back out and plays in that area. That's their backyard. They tend to think they're safe.
Well, the
Russians,
right?
Yeah, the Russians going to have to change their mindset. This is a wartime theater, wartime environment for them at sea, and they've got to start paying attention to it.
Got it. Well, thank you, Chris. Really fascinating discussion. Thanks again, Mike, for joining in on this chat. And we'll see everyone again next week.